Hey guys, this is Pat Tivoli and you are very welcome to episode number 220 of the Pat Tivoli podcast. Hello and welcome back to the podcast, episode number 220. I hope you're well and happy. Today's episode is a follow-up episode, a part 2, if you will, from my last episode, which was an introduction to the shadow. Some exercises, ideas, and perspectives around shadow work and how we can gently lean into shadow work, which really revolves around accepting the parts of ourselves that maybe we have some difficulty with. So lots of great feedback on the last episode. I gave a couple of exercises on that one, practical exercises, journaling prompts and such that you might look to implement and just be curious with. And yeah, we're going to go further into it today. There's a nice little story I want to start with today. This is a Taoist story that I heard at a recent retreat, and it's kind of around judgment and I suppose our judging minds. Our minds have a tendency to make things good or bad or right or wrong or up or down or whatever it might be. It's very analytical, very binary. And this can cause a lot of suffering because when we think things are bad, we can find ourselves going into a negative downward spiral and we get very, I suppose, obsessed with what's going on right in front of us and we lose focus of the bigger picture. So as we talk about shadow work in today's episode, we'll be talking about parts of ourselves that we've labeled bad and maybe come into a wider perspective and seeing that maybe those parts aren't bad. Maybe those parts have value too. And by understanding them and integrating them, we can come to more wholeness, we can come to more self-acceptance, and we can also come to accept other people because we tend to project the stuff we don't like in ourselves onto other people. So here's the short story. There's a Taoist story of an old farmer who had worked with his crops for many years. One day his horse ran away. Upon hearing the news, his neighbours came to visit. "Such bad luck," they said sympathetically. "Maybe," the farmer replied. The next morning, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. "How wonderful," the neighbours exclaimed. "Maybe," replied the old man. The following day, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses, was thrown and broke his leg. The neighbours again came to offer their sympathy for what they called his misfortune. "Maybe," answered the farmer. The day after, military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army. Seeing that their son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbour congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out. "Maybe," said the farmer. I think it's a nice story and a nice reminder that when the thing in front of us seems to be going perfectly, know that it's not going to last forever. And equally, when there's a massive challenge right in front of us and things seem a bit dire, that's not going to last forever either. So just that ability to find perspective, take a step back and have trust and patience. So today's episode, Meeting the Shadow Part 2, I'm going to share some great ideas on this episode. But first, I want to share 2 quick notes from our show sponsors. Did you know over 6 million people in Ireland and the UK take CBD? The main reason so many people take CBD is because it's a great natural food supplement that supports a healthy mind and body, and more specifically can help you sleep, reduce anxiety and stress, and reduce inflammation or pain in the body. This podcast is sponsored by Ethos, an Irish CBD brand who currently have 3 CBD oil ranges, Natural, Balance and Sleep, which can be purchased online at ethos-cbd.com or in pharmacy and health food stores. I take Ethos CBD oil every day because I know it's good for me and I find it particularly good for my sleep. I'm delighted to partner with the guys and give all podcast listeners access to a 15% discount code for Ethos CBD oils and a downloadable day and night journal which I curated with the guys to help you set good intentions for your day and reflect before bed. I have included a link in this podcast show notes where you can access these. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the science and benefits of CBD, be sure to check out episode number 190 of the podcast where I had an in-depth conversation with Fergus, one of the co-founders of Ethos. Today's episode of the podcast is sponsored by Apollo Health and Wellness, Galway's premier health and wellness centre. Apollo offer recovery and spa packages combining different services that tailor toward your needs. If you're trying to just relax or recover from an intensive training session, or you're looking for a day out to unwind, Apollo have you covered. They've got a range of services including a private sauna, hot tub, ice baths, compression therapy, cryotherapy and their float tanks. I'm a huge fan of the float tank, have been using it for the last 2 years. And I'm delighted now that they've also got the sauna, ice bath, hot tub, etc., which makes for a great full day out. All podcast listeners will get 10% off any of Apollo's services or packages by simply using the discount code PAT 10 at checkout. Visit apollohealthandwellness.ie for more. So, getting into it, a reminder, if you didn't listen to the last episode, it might be worth having a listen to get a bit more context. But as a reminder, we're talking about shadow work, and the shadow really relates to the parts of ourselves we've maybe made unacceptable, unlovable, the parts of ourselves that we look to deny, the parts we hide from the world and also hide from ourselves. And it relates largely to the parts of ourselves that are unconscious. So this term of shadow work was coined by Carl Jung, but it's been something that's gone on across all shamanic cultures for countless years. Straight off the bat, worth noting, shadow can oftentimes, I suppose, bring about a connotation of being something bad or something scary. The shadow is not bad. It's not evil. Carl Jung was once quoted as saying that 90% of the shadow is pure gold. It's not something that needs to be healed. It's not something that needs to be fixed. It just needs to be integrated. And so we're going to talk about how that might be done today. There's shadow work practitioners out there that you can go and work with specifically that are highly trained in this work. And there's some really powerful work that can be done. The ideas I'm sharing on these episodes are just introductory and just a way of dipping your toe in the water if it's something that's of interest to you. I think a lot of personal development or personal acceptance work or therapy work or counseling work could be defined in some ways as shadow work, because it's, again, about making unconscious aspects of our personalities, our behaviors, our experiences, our emotions conscious, bringing things that are in the dark into the light. So we can think about the shadow. So as a reminder, we come into the world whole beings, meaning we are full expression. We show all of our emotions. We don't have any shame around our emotions. We demonstrate whatever behavior feels good for us. We have spontaneity. We have playfulness. We're not afraid to express anger or sadness or any other emotion. But as we get a little bit older, we start to filter and edit who we are based on the environment that we grow up in. And so we develop a persona. And persona really is the mask we wear that we don't even realize that we're wearing. Okay, so persona, this mask we wear, we don't even realize we have on, or a series of masks. Maybe I have a mask that I wear with my family to gain approval and acceptance there. And then there's a different mask in the workplace and maybe a different mask on social media. And really it's this good guy or good girl that we want to show to the world. And then anything that's not in the persona could be said to be in the shadow. These are the hidden traits within the psyche. So the parts that our ego doesn't want to associate with, the parts that our persona doesn't want to associate with. So it'll contain things like repressed emotions, difficult beliefs, painful experiences. And one of the things we see, particularly in the personal development world, is that there's a real focus put on the light. How can I be more positive? How can I be more grateful? How can I be more successful? How can I be more confident? And one of the challenges with this is that when we take this approach and we prioritize the light, we don't actually remove the dark. We just put it further into shadow. So I mentioned this on the last episode. Our persona is like a pride position, things that we're proud of. But when we have things that we're proud of, we kind of inherently put things into a different box. So one thing goes into the pride box, but then the opposite trait oftentimes goes into the shame position or the shame box. So I mentioned, I think on the last episode, if I'm proud of the fact that I'm creative, maybe my analytical side goes into shadow, and I don't like to. We often see this with artist types, very artsy, very good with the flow, and maybe don't like to be as structured. So maybe structured aspects of their personality has gone into shadow. And it's not that we're expecting people to change their personality and be something different to who they are. But in that example, maybe the artist, I hope there's no artist kicking my ass as I say this, but maybe the artist or the more creative type who doesn't see themselves as analytical or doesn't see themselves as someone who likes to plan or likes to be organized in certain aspects, would benefit from touching on those other aspects that have gone into shadow and seeing them and seeing that maybe sometimes those aspects are useful. Another example, if I'm someone who loves to be seen as easygoing, calm, people-pleasing, someone who's a nice person to be around, maybe in shadow, I've got other aspects that I haven't seen in myself and I've made unconscious to myself. Maybe I don't like to be seen as sticking up for myself. I don't like to be seen as being particular about where we go for food or about what decisions we make. I don't like to be seen as someone who is challenging or hostile or angry. But again, if we can start to shine light on those other aspects and not demonstrate them all the time, but actually understand them so that we can use them when we need them, we almost increase our toolbox. If we're to think about the different traits as almost like a toolbox, different tools are needed in different circumstances. So if I'm always the nice guy, there's probably circumstances where that's going to let me down, and I'm going to self-abandon, and I'm going to, judge myself, judge others, and really struggle with that. So as we reject certain parts of ourselves, it can bring about feelings of unworthiness. It can bring about feelings of being unlovable. And so if we're willing to lean into these aspects and come to accept these parts of ourselves through gentle, compassionate inquiry, we can start to integrate them. So the more material there is in our shadow, the more unintegrated aspects of ourselves there are, the denser our shadow becomes. And as a result, we tend to judge other people, we project onto other people, we tend to often isolate ourselves and condemn ourselves and other people. Okay, so the behaviors and the judgments we put on ourselves, we also put on others, and vice versa. And so there's value in doing this work, is what I'm trying to say. So traits in themselves are neutral. All traits are neutral, but we put judgments on different traits. Again, anger in itself is neutral, but we put judgments on it and we call it good or we call it bad. But there's obviously context required. I've often mentioned it on episodes that anger is an aspect of ourselves that can be demonstrated in a clean way and can help us put boundaries in place, can help us say, no, that's not okay with me. So anger in itself is not good or bad. It's contextual. So traits are neutral. It's how we demonstrate the traits that matter. Because a lot of the traits that we've made wrong appeared in our childhood, and we had that early conditioning where things were put in the good box or the bad box, we maybe don't have that perspective. And so something that I learned as a child was bad stays in the bad box. And now I struggle to access it. I can't see it. I can't use it. When in reality, if I was willing to integrate that aspect of myself, I would have choice and I'd be able to use that at certain times. As human beings, we're supposed to have a wide spectrum of emotions. And, I think in the modern world is the idea of we're supposed to be happy all the time. We're supposed to be confident all the time. We're supposed to be outgoing all the time. We're supposed to be social. We're supposed to be all these, again, light traits. And there's a denial of the more difficult traits. But even sadness can be a really useful and really human trait. If it goes into shadow, it's really going to affect my life in a negative way. Maybe I find myself really sad every Sunday evening before going into my place of work because I really don't like my work. But if I don't allow myself to feel the sadness or the frustration or whatever's coming up for me, and I instead choose to numb myself and try to be positive and try to be grateful, or else I turn to addictions and I do things to get away from the feeling. In other words, if I'm not willing to feel the feeling, I can't extract the wisdom from the feeling. So the feeling is there for a reason. The feeling is coming as feedback. The emotion is pointing me in a different direction. It's saying there's a recurring theme here, Pat. Every Sunday you feel stressed and sad before going back to work. But again, if I'm not willing to listen to the emotion and see it as feedback rather than as a bad thing, again, if it's a bad thing, I just put it in a box and I hide from it. But if I look at it and I'm gentle and I'm compassionate with it and I ask, what are you trying to teach me? There's always wisdom there, because our emotions and our feelings point to parts of ourselves that are in the unconscious. It's why when I get emotional reactions around certain people, that can be really uncomfortable. But if I'm willing to be curious and I can take a few breaths, I can start to ask myself, what is it about this person that's triggering my feeling of anger, or my feeling of frustration, my feeling of judgment, my feeling of admiration, whatever it might be? Because it's not just the darker parts of ourselves that go into shadow. There's also the golden shadow. So the parts of ourselves that were made wrong that maybe would be really useful for us. I said in the last episode, a lot of the things we admire in other people are aspects of our golden shadow. So when I look at other people and I say they're so creative, they're so talented, they're so generous, they're so kind, they're so consistent. Oftentimes when I have a lot of intensity around these admiration, these parts that I admire, these are aspects of my golden shadow. So here's a quote from Steve Wolf. I've started reading quotes on the podcast. Have you noticed? I've got notes now. Professional. Beneath the social mask we wear every day, we have a hidden shadow self, an impulsive, wounded, sad, or isolated part that we generally try to ignore. The shadow can be a source of emotional richness and vitality, and acknowledging it can be a pathway to healing and an authentic life. So again, beneath the social mask we wear every day, we have hidden shadows. We have a hidden shadow side, an impulsive, wounded, sad, or isolated part that we generally try to ignore. The shadow can be a source of emotional richness and vitality, and acknowledging it can be a pathway to healing and an authentic life. I was on a retreat. I was going on 2 retreats recently. I did a retreat with Illuman, a 5-day initiation retreat. I actually did a second initiation, which you're probably not supposed to do, with the Mankind Project. But one of the themes that come up in one of those retreats was that we can only learn a certain amount from success, particularly after the age of 30. And what I took from that was that, you can achieve lots in your life and there's a certain amount to be gained from achieving. But if you always think you have to go to more success and more success and more success, it becomes empty at a certain point. And so there's a huge amount to be learned by looking in the opposite direction. So not looking to make everything perfect, not looking to make everything bright and light and positive. But again, integration rather than trying to add more, because we can add more and add more and add more and add more. But those denied parts of ourselves, again, are going further into shadow and getting denser and denser and denser, and leading to more reactionary behavior. So again, these rejected, shamed, or ridiculed parts don't go away. They're there in the background and they come out in unconscious patterns. Quote from John Bradshaw: the disowned part of self is an energy, an emotion or desire or need that has been shamed every time it emerged. These energy patterns are repressed but not destroyed. They are alive and are unconscious. The disowned parts of self is an energy, an emotion or desire or need that has been shamed every time it emerged. These energy patterns are repressed but not destroyed. They are alive and are unconscious. And so again, that points to the idea that oftentimes when I have strong emotional reactions to other people's behavior or how other people show up, it's pointing to parts of myself that have been disowned, parts of my personality that I haven't accepted. Again, these are largely born in our childhood, and it's either through implicit or explicit messaging. There'll be a silly example I can remember from my own childhood. One of my earliest memories was growing up in Limerick and being 3 or 4 years old and being in the library. And the librarian was reading a book to a group of us. There was, 10 kids there. And the librarian's reading the book and she was saying, John has glasses. And I would shout out, my daddy's got glasses. And she said, okay, good. And then she'd say the next thing, John lives in Limerick. I said, my daddy lives in Limerick. And eventually she shushed me. If you imagine that from the outside looking in, it makes complete sense. She's reading a story to 10 kids. One person's talking and shouting and looking for attention. That's not going to work. And so she shushed me. But then imagine maybe from the child's perspective, if I look at myself back then, maybe my 3 or 4 year old self took the implied belief on board that you're not supposed to talk or you're not supposed to offer anything when someone else is speaking. You're not supposed to offer anything. So maybe it goes into shadow and you become a bit more introverted or a bit more shy in wanting to share. Maybe you come to learn that your voice isn't welcome in a bigger group. Maybe you come to learn there's a sense of shame. And so again, that's an example. So the child doesn't have context. The child doesn't understand that there's a story to be read. It needs to be heard. The child just thinks, I'm talking about myself here in the third person in a way, but the child just thinks, okay, I did something wrong. I did something bad. And so again, without that context, certain aspects of the personality can just disappear and be repressed, denied, or unacceptable. As mentioned in the last episode, probably the starting point in terms of recognizing some of these traits, both golden and dark, is to recognize some of the projections that we have on other people. So some of the judgments we have toward other people, or some of the words that we struggle with, some of the judgments we struggle with when we hear them toward ourselves. They make this differentiation between disturbed or informed. And I say, I can have a friend who is very loud, but I can just say, oh, they're a loud person. And it doesn't really create an emotional response within me. But maybe I have another friend and that other friend is very sarcastic and that disturbs me. Okay, so the loudness informs me, doesn't really elicit an emotional response within me, but the sarcasm disturbs me. It really makes me feel irky. It makes me feel sick to my stomach, or I feel it in my body. I feel this trigger in my body. This is something we notice, is that we tend to live in our heads and become disembodied. It's almost like there was times in our life, well, it is like there was times in our life where things got overwhelming or traumatic in ways, and we weren't able to be with our intense emotions. And so we went to our heads, we disconnected from our bodies and went to our heads and tried to figure out, how do I stay safe in this scenario? A little bit off topic, but we've got this fight, flight, or freeze response. Okay, fight, flight, or freeze. So when we feel under threat, when we feel in danger, when we feel overwhelmed in any way, we get this response within the body that's there to keep us safe. And it's fight, flight, or freeze. So fight the enemy, run away, or freeze. Oftentimes as kids, we didn't have the opportunity to fight or run away. And so maybe we freeze, and again, we become disembodied and we go straight to our heads. But the stuff is still going on in our bodies. And again, when we notice triggers from things that people say to us, or we see triggers in other people's behaviors, we tend to again feel it in our body. So just that differentiation between informed by someone's behavior, doesn't really have that emotional response, disturbed by someone's behavior, that does have an emotional response. And the stronger the emotional response, typically, the stronger this aspect is in our shadow. The bigger this is in our shadow, which is hard to accept in a way, but it's also can bring great freedom, because as I integrate that aspect back into myself, I judge myself less harshly, I understand myself more deeply, and I've got more choice in life. Gabor Mate gives an example. I used to share a similar example a couple of years ago. I can't remember specifically the example I used to share or even where I heard it. But Gabor often asks people, how do you feel when I call you lazy? There'll be different responses. Some people will say, when you call me lazy, I feel pissed off. I feel agitated. No, I'm not lazy. I feel reactive. And then he asks, how do you feel when I call you a green bush? And they say, I don't feel anything when you call me a green bush. And his point to it is, if I call you a green bush, you know you're not a green bush. And so there's no emotional response. But if I call you lazy, or I call you rude, or I call you stubborn, or I call you a bitch, or I call you a prick, or call you whatever, then there's an emotional response. There's a part of you that hasn't made peace with maybe that's a part of you. And so, again, we can start to notice in our emotional responses some of these aspects that we're hiding. These projections we put onto other people, or these parts of ourselves that we struggle to accept in ourselves, can provide a doorway into the shadow, and can provide this kind of invitation back to wholeness. Because again, the more of this stuff I can reintegrate, the more I can accept myself. So I'm going to share a couple of exercises. In some ways, today's a bit of a recap episode, but I'm going to share a couple of exercises that might be useful. These are journaling style exercises, and I would always go slow with them and create safety. It's important that we feel safe when we do these exercises. And so that's just a case of leaning in gently. And if you feel overwhelmed at any stage, lean back out and just look after yourself. So our shadow parts are born out of fear, times where we were scared or overwhelmed, trying to protect ourselves. And so we don't want to make ourselves fearful of doing this work. We want to bring compassion to this and gentleness to this. So as you lean in, just going slow and just being gentle with yourself. A nice exercise, actually, on a side that I've come to recently that can be useful in terms of grounding. So groundedness, being grounded is about being in the present moment and not being stuck in old memories, or not being stuck in old overwhelm or stress or whatever it might be. A nice little exercise for grounding is to look around you. This is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So look around you and list 5 things you can see in your environment. So maybe you'll do this as you're with me here if you're not driving a car. 5 things you see in your environment. And then come to 4 things you can feel. 4 things you can feel. So maybe you can feel your feet on the ground. Maybe you can feel your clothes against your skin. Maybe you can feel whatever else is coming up for you. So 4 things you can feel, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear. So what can you hear within your environment? You probably hear my voice. Maybe 1 or 2 other things that you can hear. 2 things you can smell. Might be a bit trickier. See if there's any sense of smell where you are. And then finally, 1 thing you can taste. Is there anything you can taste? So this can be a nice little grounding exercises. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come back into the present moment. Realize you're here and now. You're not stuck in the old stories. You're not stuck in the old experiences. You're here and you're now. So 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste. Okay, here's the exercises. First exercise again is back to this idea of projection. This is probably the easiest starting point, or the most obvious starting point in seeing the parts of ourselves we've denied. Okay, so again, our emotional reactions point to stuff that we're unconscious of. And so it's worth noticing what traits in other people elicit an emotional response within you. And there's typically 2 types of emotional responses. There's infatuation. Well, there's probably judgment before there's infatuation. So judgment maybe is looking down on someone, seeing a part that they're expressing outwardly that we refuse to express outwardly. So we see something in someone else that we've denied in ourselves, and so we judge it harshly. The other side is infatuation. So again, we see something in someone else that they're expressing that we've denied in ourselves, but it's an infatuation. It's putting them on a pedestal. So again, it's either putting someone in the pit where they're lower than us, or it's putting someone on a pedestal where they're higher than us, rather than seeing everyone on an equal playing field. So again, this comes down to this idea of judgment, labeling things good or bad, rather than having perspective. And so with this exercise, I'm going to list a number of traits. I'm going to list a large number of traits. And these traits may or may not elicit emotional responses within you. There's a great book called The Dark Side of the Light Chasers by Debbie Ford. She lists a similar exercise. And so all you do, if you're in a place where you can close your eyes, you might close your eyes. And as I list these traits, just observe what goes on in your body and observe if any of these traits elicit an emotional response. In other words, if any of these traits wake up any physical sensations in the body, maybe make your stomach feel a little tight, maybe you feel it in your heart, maybe you feel it somewhere in your body. Again, noticing where you're informed versus where you're disturbed. And every time you hear a voice or hear a word that's maybe disturbing, you might just open your eyes, jot down the word, and then come back, closing your eyes. And I'll continue to list the words. So the first list I'll read will be, I suppose, dark shadow material. The other list I'll read will be golden shadow material. And we'll just, again, staying curious as to, have I denied these parts of myself? Is there a possibility that this thing that makes me uncomfortable is a part of me? And would I be willing to gently lean into that and be curious? Again, rather than judging it, rather than making it wrong, just be curious. So here we go with the lists. Aggressive, angry, anxious, arrogant, bitchy, blunt, boring, cold, compulsive, cowardly, deceitful, dependent, difficult, dishonest, extreme, flippant, forgetful, greedy, grumpy, hateful, ignorant, impatient, inconsiderate, indecisive, irresponsible, jealous, miserable, moody, narcissistic, obnoxious, obsessive, opinionated, pathetic, petulant, predatory, rash, resentful, rude, self-indulgent, shameless, stubborn, tactful, uncaring, unkind, unrealistic, weak-willed, withdrawn. So again, as I have read that list, just noticing what goes on for you, noticing which of those words elicit the strongest response, and just gently being curious. As I say, there's that idea of the green bush. If we were called the green bush, it wouldn't mean anything to us, but sometimes these words can sting a little bit. Again, open to the idea that maybe there's a gift in them. As Carl Jung said, 90% of the shadow is pure gold. Okay, second list. Same idea here. This is possibly golden shadow. Adventurous. Just noticing what comes up in your body. Balanced. Brilliant. Captivating. Charming. Compassionate. Considerate. Creative. Decisive. Educated. Dependable. Disciplined. Empathetic. Encouraging. Flexible. Generous. Hardworking. Heroic. Honest. Humble. Independent. Intelligent. Logical. Loyal. Modest. Optimistic. Organized. personable, practical, profound, relaxed, reliable, secure, self-confident, sincere, spontaneous, stoic, sympathetic, tolerant, unassuming, versatile, willing, witty. So again, as you go through those traits, or as I go through those traits, just noticing what's the response within me? What's going on in my body as I hear those words? And what might that be informing me? What might that be pointing to in the unconscious? And getting a sense of curiosity. I start to notice the dark and the golden traits that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable for me to hear or to me to consider maybe a part of me. And then I can start to just get curious about those parts. Where might that part be useful in my life? Where may I have demonstrated that in my life? Where may I be currently demonstrating it, but just not seeing it? So for example, on the golden traits, I listed organized. Maybe I get this feeling in my body, oh, organization triggers something in me. And maybe my story is I'm not organized. Now, there's two things that could be happening there. One is it's something I've denied in myself and something that's just not happening. Two is I just can't see it. So maybe I am very organized in certain aspects of my life, but I'm just not willing to look at that because I think organization needs to look a certain way. And so I overlook all the ways that I am organized. That's the first exercise for today. I'm full of quotes at the moment, but Carl Jung's quote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And so again, this idea that all these traits that you've written down, if there's some traits that you've written down that elicit emotional response, carry a lot of energy. And on an unconscious level, we will attract things in our lives that are congruent with these aspects. Okay, so again, if bitchy is something I wrote down that I haven't accepted in myself, there's a lot of energy being carried in that, in repressing and hiding it from the world and hiding it from myself. And so that energy will attract on an unconscious level people to my life that show me bitchiness. Because again, there's something in me that I can't see, and so I see it out there. Okay, next exercise, second exercise. I'm just going to share three in a tree. I'm going to share 3 or 4 exercises. Second exercise, to recognize our complexes. In other words, our patterns. Okay, so recognizing our patterns can be a great way of recognizing some of our shadow. And so with this, we can look at what are some of the repeating patterns in my life? What are some of the repeating patterns in my life? This could be anything from, I'm very all or nothing. I tend to take on a huge amount and then I go into the shadow for a while, or go into, like, no pun intended, I go into the cave for a while and I do nothing. Maybe it's I take on too much at once and that's just overwhelming. Maybe it's that I constantly self-sabotage. Maybe it's I keep going back to certain addictions. Maybe it's I keep attracting the same type of partner. So just recognizing some of the repeating patterns. Mine, as an example, I've shared this on episodes in the past, was that one of the things that was in my shadow was that I didn't trust people. I didn't recognize that this was a pattern that I had developed as a story, that people are going to let me down. And so again, I go back to childhood, being bullied, moving to different schools, and just having this unconscious belief that at some stage people are going to let me down. And so the mind comes up with defense mechanisms to keep me safe. And in the shadow is this idea that people are going to abandon me. And so I've got to protect myself. I've got to keep myself safe. Now, again, if that's going on in the unconscious, I kept attracting those types of situations. And so it became like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So my belief that people can't be trusted had me pushing people away. I would push people away in different ways because my story was eventually, and I wasn't conscious of this story, but eventually people are going to let me down. So, I would perpetuate that cycle. Again, our unconscious, these aspects will run our lives. Again, Carl Jung quote, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life and we will call it fate. So one of the things can be useful as you start to notice these patterns is to give them a name so that you can begin to see it as something separate. So in that example, I was saying, I keep pushing people away. People are going to let me down. I characterized that version of me as the lone shark. And so when I could see patterns emerging where I wasn't leaning in relationship, where I wasn't making time for people that mattered to me, where I wasn't investing in the most important relationships in my life, I could recognize that's not me. That's the lone shark that's acting. That's the part of me. There's a part of me that thinks people are going to let me down. But equally, there's a part of me that knows that I can develop great relationships and I can be social and I can do all these things. So it's useful, again, as you recognize your patterns and you see the origins of those patterns, you can give it a different name and you can start to see it as something separate. Here's a short exercise that might be a way of identifying one of your patterns. An exercise you can do is to recognize what your frustrations tend to be in relationships. So what are your frustrations in relationships? Be that intimate relationships, be that work relationships, be that friendships, be that family relationships. But what frustrates you in relationships? Is there a recurring theme? People don't show up consistently for me. People expect me to read their minds. People don't understand me. What are the frustrations in relationship? And then following on from that, consider what are the traits or the behaviors that agitate you the most in those relationships. So what are the traits or the behaviors? Maybe I say I get agitated when people are not good communicators. I get agitated when people are not honest. I get agitated when people don't show up consistently. I get agitated when people are sarcastic. So I list the traits. So what are my frustrations in relationship? What traits or behaviors agitate me? And then the bit where we can start to get curious. Where might I demonstrate those same traits toward myself? Okay, so if my frustration in dating or relationship is that people don't show up consistently and are half-arsed or half in it, I would bring it back to myself. Where do I demonstrate that trait within myself? Where do I only show up halfway for myself? Where do I not show up for myself consistently? Where do I half-ass my relationship with myself? Okay, so where do I demonstrate that trait in my relationship to myself? Second question you can ask is, where do you demonstrate that relationship in the person you're projecting onto? Okay, so if you've got a family member and your judgment toward them and your frustration toward them is that they're closed-minded, you can ask yourself, where am I closed-minded in my relationship toward them? And then the next bit, the last bit, is where do I demonstrate those traits toward other people? Okay, so what we've done with this exercise, we've listed a frustration, listed some of the traits or behaviors that agitate or upset us. And then we've explored 3 ways that we might demonstrate those same traits toward ourselves, toward the person in question, and toward other people. You know, other people can represent so well how we treat ourselves. And again, it feels so familiar. The relationship outside there feels so familiar to what's going on in our unconscious. The person in front of me who I feel is not showing up consistently and is not putting in effort is pointing me back to the fact I'm not showing up consistently for myself in my own practices, whatever it might be. Okay, 2 more exercises, shorter ones here. I'd love to hear feedback also if these more journaling-based exercises are useful. I know some people enjoyed the last one. Third idea is just curiosity, and just simply curiosity. And just this recognition that if I've got shadow stuff going on that I'm not aware of, we can sure as hell bet that everyone else in the world, we've all got it. So again, if you've got stuff going on that's in the shadows, then the people that stress you and frustrate you in your life also have that same stuff going on. So just a sense of curiosity. The people that agitate you, again, recognizing their traits, just considering why might that person be that way? Where might they have had to develop or express that trait? A kind of simple example on this is oftentimes there's been this story of a lot of men are unemotional. They don't show their emotions. They're shut down. Again, curiosity around that might say, why is that person that way? Maybe a short answer is, well, their parents were probably the same way, and go back just a couple of generations and the men were at war and they had to shut down emotion, and that gets passed down. So just a sense of curiosity. Maybe there's someone in the workplace who's lazy and that triggers us. And we say, okay, what is it about them that triggers me? It's the laziness. Why might that person be lazy? And you're going to have to be somewhat creative with this, but just training ourselves to have a bit more perspective. Maybe that person is lazy because the last place they worked, maybe they worked hard, but the harder they worked, the more work was put on them. And it felt thankless and it felt exhausting and they got burnt out. So maybe they've learned a new way of operating. Maybe their laziness is a protective mechanism in some way. All of our traits are trying to protect us in some way because we've learned, oftentimes in distorted ways, how we're supposed to show up in the world. And third exercise is not a written exercise as such, can be, I suppose, but just bringing that sense of curiosity into your relationships in the coming weeks. What's irritating me in this person? Where might they have learned that trait? Where might that be useful for them? Why might they have to show up like that? Fourth and final exercise then is morning pages. Morning pages. Morning Pages was a journaling program founded, I think, initially for artists by Julia Cameron, who wrote a book called The Artist's Way. And it's a really simple process. The idea is that every day you get up in the morning and you write 3 foolscap pages, stream of consciousness writing. So you write whatever's on your mind and you don't think. And the reason I list this as a good example is that when we just write without filtering, without editing, without having to make it look a certain way, and when we make that a consistent practice, it can be a fast path to the unconscious. It can get us into the unconscious. Just give you an example of what that might look like. Sometimes I'll ask people, what's your goal? And they'll say, I have no idea what my goal is. And I'll say, if you did know what your goal is, what's your goal? And immediately they'll answer. So oftentimes we have huge awareness and huge wisdom within us, but we push it down by getting very logical and talking ourselves out of doing things. Maybe I know in my heart I want to make a huge change in my life, and I know the exact change I want to make, but then my mind comes up with a million reasons why I have to stay exactly where I am. And so an exercise like morning pages, where it's not filtered, not edited, not supposed to look pretty, not going to be reread, you just write for 3 foolscap pages every morning, first thing in the morning. Just dump your thoughts on paper. Again, don't reread it, don't edit it, don't filter it, just let it flow. And this can be a way that starts to present the same patterns start to emerge every day. Stuff that you had ignored or denied or repressed or were just unaware of. So that's a really useful exercise as well. So a couple of ideas there. That's our second shadow work episode. So I'll knock it in the head and take a break now for a while with the shadow work stuff. But I hope it's been interesting or useful for you. Again, our goal with all this stuff is to integrate and illuminate the shadow, not to get rid of it. All traits are neutral in themselves. It's just how we demonstrate them. So as we shine light on these new parts and as we come to know new parts of ourselves, we come to a greater level of choice. So again, if I know that I'm capable of the best things in the world and the worst things in the world, I can be more present and I can say, okay, well, I'm going to be, you think about it this way. If I've got a lot of dense energy and I'm got a lot of stuff going on, trying to protect myself in a million different ways based on my past, I'm not present. But as I start to clear this stuff and I start to get more and more access to the different parts of myself, I can be present. And when I'm present, I can have choice. When I'm not present, I'm acting on old beliefs. So again, use that example of, for years, I believed I couldn't trust people. And as I come to understand that was a part of myself, that I was pushing people away, now I can be present. So now when I'm in a relationship, sometimes that story comes up again. I can't trust people. And I have a choice now, because I can choose, do I act in accordance to my old beliefs and story, or do I act in the new beliefs and story? Our freedom in life lies on this ability to be able to choose in any given situation. So this just allows for choice. Slow and steady with this stuff. It's not a rush. It's not like switching on or flicking on a switch. It's just about increased awareness, shining a little bit more light, giving us a little bit more choice, a little bit more freedom, a little bit more wholeness, a little bit more lightness. If this stuff is interesting to you, a book I would definitely recommend as a nice starting point is Debbie Ford's book, The Dark Side of the Light Chasers. Debbie Ford's book, The Dark Side of the Light Chasers. As you get into it, then maybe you might like Robert Bly's work. Robert Bly talks about the shadow bag. So he says, from the time we're young, we have this bag over our shoulder and we put all the parts that are unacceptable into this bag. In the first couple of years, it's the things our family teach us are unacceptable. Then it's the things our teachers teach us are unacceptable. Then our friends. And by the time we're 20, there's a huge amount put in the bag, and we carry that bag for years, and it feels heavy and it feels like we're trudging through life. That's worth looking at as well. Okay, that is it. Much love. Thank you as ever for listening. I appreciate you. I hope you're doing well. And stay tuned. I will be back with another episode in the coming days. And we're going to talk about polyvagal theory and creating safety in our bodies and minds. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon.